Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So, I want to develop an idea. At least I'm going to try to develop an idea. If this works, I will post it. If not, it will go into the trash bin of history. We as a society never really look at ourselves from the standpoint of historical context. And by that I mean, we right now, in this very specific moment, in this very specific point in time, we consider ourselves, we're at the edge of reality in this sense. We're at the edge of time. We're, everything else is going behind us. We look at this from a standpoint of we're looking back at history because we ourselves at the cusp. But at some point, we're not going to be at the cusp. This very specific, this very instant of time will be somebody else's past. Some group, some civilization, some culture, we will be in their past. And what does that look like? What do we look like from their perspective? Looking at the arc of history and the way that history tends to move, or the direction that history tends to move. Back during slave periods in American history, and that's not that far ago in this expanse of time, it was perfectly okay for one human being to own another human being. Not just okay, the societal structures itself sprung up around this in order to maintain and justify that particular institution. It is perfectly okay to subjugate and force a human being to work for another human being. Yes, he would get living quarters and he would get scraps, but ultimately at the end of the day, he is working for very, very little for subsistence. That was okay. Not just okay. If that slave tried to run away, he would be captured. And in that slave's head, that slave is probably thinking to himself from a feeling standpoint, not necessarily from an intellectual standpoint, from a feeling standpoint, I'm doing something wrong. I'm doing something bad. I'm trying to escape my freedom. I'm being held in bondage and captive. And yet, from an emotional standpoint, I would wager he thought to himself, I am doing something wrong. The ideology, the culture, the societal structures, all of those things sprung up in order to support that particular institution. Even though as ghastly as it was, making it okay. Same thing with the genocide of the Native American population. Institutions sprung up to make that perfectly okay. It was just. If that slave ran away, the slave owner would be pissed. Dare that slave run away from me? How dare he? I'm losing my property. I'm losing my property. The idea that that's a person was less relevant. It was less relevant for self-interest. So don't misunderstand me. Certainly, I think they understood that this was a person. And maybe they did. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in their heads that this was the case. They bought into the propaganda. But I would imagine that the propaganda was easy to buy into when it massively advantaged them. So, I'm going off the rails. The point I'm trying to make here is you had a very specific, a very small subset of people that was advantaging themselves magnificently off of the labor of others. The labor that those people were doing, subsistence level, in order to keep themselves alive, just to continuously do labor. Essentially a hamster wheel. Fast forward, going from the standpoint of a war to destroy that nasty and disgusting institution, to what we have now. I'm making the point that from the standpoint of a historical context, they will look back on us and they would say, why did those people allow the earth to be destroyed in this way for this capitalistic system? And why were they okay with subjecting themselves to what amounts to some degree of an enhanced degree of slave labor? Ultimately, they won the ability to choose the plantation that they were going to work, but ultimately they still had to choose a plantation. And working 40, 50 hours a week, essentially working themselves into poverty, while other people were advantaged magnificently off their labor and the resources of their particular planet. Why did they allow themselves to do that? Why did they think that that was freedom? In the same way that the ideologies and everything else sprung up to support that particular institution. I'm making the point. Same thing here. The ideology, the culture, all of those things spring up to support this particular institution, this capitalistic institution, in which labor is completely and directly tied to whether or not a person was going to have their resources met. or their needs met. Your society is beyond this point of subsistence. It's at the point of surplus. Advertisements sprung up in order to get people to consistently buy stuff, more and more and more stuff. The economic system is arranged in a way where buying shitty and ridiculous things is used to propel the economy forward. I mean, ultimately, you buying stuff allows somebody else to have a job. The societal impact doesn't apply. What it means to the environment doesn't apply. What it means to individuals working these poverty wages doesn't apply. None of this stuff applies. What applies is markets. Markets matter more than human beings. Now, in pursuant to this, markets matter more than human beings, people are compelled to work. They're compelled to work in a way of not having their needs meet. This kind of, I want to call it absolute violence, but this almost hidden violence of people being prodded along, a human being a fry cook, working things that they absolutely hate purely because they just needs to make bare ends meet. If you're working 40 and 50 hours a week at a job that you completely despise, then you're not free. You're not free. If you need to work 40 and 50 hours a week, in the first place, using your energy, your labor, essentially everything that makes you, the majority of your time at the expense of somebody else, making somebody else massive amounts of profit while you yourself barely make ends meet, on a hamster wheel, consistently vulnerable. I submit to you that yes, the slave had a bare subsistence. You've eked out a little bit more, and something that was an institution that for the most part had a certain segment of the population. Well, you've expanded that to, for the most part, the entirety of the country. The majority of the country is either working a poverty wage or is just in poverty. The UN just did a thing showing third world poverty conditions within the United States. This is the richest country on the planet. You can choose your plantation, but ultimately you're still choosing a plantation and working this much for so little. That's not freedom. You get to choose between Pepsi and Coke, fair enough, but the bigger choices, meaning the way that these guys get over on the tax code, the way that these guys get over on these trade deals, the ebb of technology in and of itself, meaning automation and shipping jobs overseas, just the natural way the capitalistic system runs in order for these guys to maximize their profit. It bleeds workers. All of these things are systemic issues with the system itself, but all of these things ultimately sends cash to one way, the top. They've owned the political apparatus, they've owned the economic apparatus. It sends cash to the top. It makes everyone else's lives more difficult while these guys advantage themselves. I'm saying, if your cash, or if your freedom in a capitalistic system purely depends on this idea of capital, meaning your range of decision space is purely determined by how much money you have in your pocket, and 60% of the population, if they got a $500 bill, will not be able to pay it. How is that freedom? How is that freedom? I suspect that future cultures will look back on us and say these people had the technical resources to supply each and everything that anyone on that planet needed, and they squandered it to the top 1%. They allowed people to accrue massive amounts of wealth, and they thought it was perfectly okay. Their society, their news, their media, their political apparatus all suited one aim: to say that what takes place in regards to the massive levels of income inequality, what takes place in regards to poverty, all of those things are acts of God. They're acts of God. We don't need to have the conversation about class or anything else. All that stuff is off the table. The political and economic apparatus suits one end. Get across an ideology that what people live through is somehow freedom, and that working and all this other stuff, even when it's completely unnecessary and even when their lives are getting more and more difficult, get across to them, make them believe that the 1% is necessary, and that the way society is the way society should and supposed to be. This, of course, is not true. There's no God making it this way. But societal structures spring up to support the ruling ideology. And the hegemonic view right now is markets matter more than human beings. And look, human beings have internalized this, by the way. They've internalized it. There is an odd situation where where you have 99% versus 1%, and the 1% essentially dictates how things are from a political standpoint and an economic standpoint, and much of the 99% agrees. And maybe they don't necessarily agree. Let me say it a different way. They've taken on the programming. Let me say it that way. But it's a weird case to take on a programming that is directly against your self-interest. That is fucking bizarre. And yet they've taken this programming on as being natural and normal. They will look back at us and they will be aghast at what we allowed to take place on this planet, and what we allowed to take place to the planet itself, meaning destroying our habitable space on this planet for the sake of somebody else's profits. Not even our own. Not even our own. My point in this is not freedom. Freedom is something else. And in the same way that that particular society thought that particular society's way of life was perfectly okay, this particular society is doing the exact same thing. This is a functional level of insanity, in the same way that it was a functional level of insanity back during slave days. They would look at us as being insane and irrational. So I will leave it at that. I think the sound is okay. I think I'm going to keep this one. So, alright guys, if you enjoy the content, feel free to share, like, subscribe, and of course, you can always support the Patreon. Thanks guys.